When people hear the word drugs, they usually imagine something secretive, something illegal, something modern. They picture dark alleys, hidden deals, and substances that exist outside normal life. But colonial America was none of those things. It was a completely different world, a world where mind-altering and body-affecting substances were not hidden at all. They were everywhere. You could find them growing in kitchen gardens, stored in plantation warehouses, served openly in taverns, packed into ship cargo crossing the Atlantic, lined up in apothecary jars, and carefully kept inside family medicine chests. Drugs were not pushed to the edges of society. They were part of daily life. Colonists drank alcohol from morning until night. They treated pain with opium-based preparations. They relied on tobacco not only as a habit but also as a remedy. And beyond these, there was an entire world of substances, herbs, roots, powders, syrups, and tinctures, all trusted to help people survive. These substances were used during sickness, during childbirths, after injuries, in moments of exhaustion, and even in times of fear. But the most important difference between their world and ours was not the presence of drugs. It was how they understood them. Colonial Americans did not separate substances into clear categories like we do today. There was no strict divide between medicine, intoxication, stimulation, healing, habit. All of these could exist together inside the same substance. A single bottle could be used to heal, to comfort, to energize, and to escape. In that world, a drug was not automatically seen as dangerous or immoral. It depended on how it was used and who was using it. And this story doesn't even begin with the colonists. Long before European settlers arrived on the Atlantic coast, indigenous peoples across the Americas already possessed deep and sophisticated knowledge of medicinal plants and psychoactive substances. They understood their environments in ways that Europeans did not. They knew which plants could heal, which could stimulate, which could calm the body or alter the mind. Tobacco, in particular, held a powerful place in many native societies. It was not just something to smoke casually. It had ceremonial meaning, social importance, and medicinal value. It was used in rituals, in healing practices, and in community life. When European explorers and settlers encountered tobacco, they didn't simply observe it. They adopted it. They carried it back across the Atlantic, introduced it to European markets, and quickly began attaching their own medical theories to it. In other words, one of the most famous substances of colonial America was not originally colonial at all. It came from indigenous knowledge, and then it was absorbed, reshaped, commercialized, and transformed by European empires. This pattern would repeat again and again. Colonial America was built not just on land and labor, but on the exchange and often exploitation of knowledge. Europeans arrived with their own medical traditions. They brought ideas rooted in ancient systems, especially the belief that the body needed balance to stay healthy. They believed illness came from imbalance, and treatment meant restoring harmony. They brought home remedies, herbal knowledge from Europe, and strong faith in traditional practices. But when they reached America, they entered a completely unfamiliar world. The climate was different, the diseases were different, the plant life was different, and their old knowledge wasn't always enough, so they adapted. They borrowed from indigenous peoples. They learned from enslaved Africans and African American healers. They experimented with new plants and new methods. Colonial medicine was never simply European medicine transplanted into a new land. It became something else entirely. A rough, improvised, and deeply unequal system built out of necessity. It was shaped by exchange, by survival, and by power. And in this world, drugs were not separate from life. They were woven into everything: health, labor, trade, and daily survival. When European settlers arrived in the Americas, they did not come empty-handed. They carried with them centuries of medical beliefs and traditions from Europe. These ideas were deeply rooted in older systems of understanding the human body, especially the belief that health depended on balance. If the body was balanced, a person was healthy. If it was out of balance, illness followed. This way of thinking shaped how colonists understood disease and how they tried to treat it. They relied on home remedies. They trusted inherited knowledge passed down through generations. And they believed that the body could be restored through careful adjustment, by removing what was harmful or strengthening what was weak. But the moment they stepped into the new world, everything changed. The land was unfamiliar. The climate was unpredictable. The diseases were often unknown, and the plants around them were unlike anything they had seen before. Suddenly, the medical knowledge they had brought from Europe was no longer enough, so they adapted. They began to observe the world around them more closely. They learned from indigenous communities who already had deep knowledge of local plants and natural remedies. They also absorbed knowledge from enslaved Africans and African American healers, who brought their own medical traditions, techniques, and understanding of the body. Over time, colonial medicine became a mixture of all these influences. It was not purely European anymore. It was something new, something built through necessity, experimentation, and unequal exchange. And at the center of this evolving system stood one powerful substance: tobacco. Tobacco was not discovered by colonists, it was encountered. It already existed as part of indigenous life, used in rituals, healing, and social practices. But once Europeans recognized its potential, they transformed it completely. They turned it into a commodity. By the early 17th century, tobacco had become essential to the survival of colonies like Virginia. The early years of settlements such as Jamestown were marked by failure, hunger, conflict, and instability. Many colonists struggled just to stay alive. But tobacco changed everything. It gave the colony something incredibly valuable, a product that could be exported and sold in international markets. And with that, colonial America became connected to a much larger system of trade. The numbers grew quickly. By 1630, England was importing at least 500,000 pounds of tobacco each year from Virginia. Just a decade later, by 1640, that number had risen to nearly 1.5 million pounds annually. What had once been a sacred plant used in ceremonies and healing had now become a driving force of wealth and expansion. It reshaped land, it reshaped labor, and it reshaped the entire colonial economy. But tobacco was never just about money. At the same time that it was fueling trade, it was also being embraced as medicine. Colonists and European physicians believed tobacco had powerful healing properties. It was praised as a kind of universal remedy, almost a cure-all. People used it to treat headaches, to relieve colds, to improve digestion, and to fight fatigue. Some even described it in almost spiritual or holy terms. To them, it wasn't just useful, it was extraordinary. And yet, even during this time of praise, there were voices of concern. Some critics warned about overuse. Others noticed signs of dependence, but these warnings did not stop its spread, because in colonial America, a substance didn't have to fit into just one role. Tobacco could be a respected medicine, a daily habit, and a growing social problem. All at the same time, there was no contradiction in that. That was simply how the world worked. Tobacco was not hidden, it was everywhere. It was part of daily routine, part of economic survival, and part of personal health. People used it openly, regularly, and without the kind of suspicion that exists today. It was not seen as a dangerous vice. It was seen as something ordinary, something useful, something necessary. And that reveals something important about colonial life. In that world, substances were not judged primarily by their chemical effects. They were judged by how they fit into society. If something helped a person work, helped them feel better, or helped them survive, it earned its place, and tobacco had earned its place completely. If tobacco helped build the colonial economy, then alcohol was what kept everyday life moving. In colonial America, drinking was not occasional, it was constant. People drank at home, at work, in taverns, during elections, at funerals, at weddings, on ships, in fields, and around dinner tables. Alcohol was everywhere. It was woven into daily routines so deeply that many people began their day with a drink and ended it the same way. For workers, drinking was as normal as taking breaks. In fact, it functioned much like coffee does in the modern world. Craftsmen drank, farmers drank, sailors drank, soldiers drank, even students drank. There was no single group that stood outside this culture. The entire society was immersed in it. The colonial world was filled with beer, cider, wine, rum, punch, and distilled spirits. But this wasn't just about enjoyment. It was also about survival. Colonists carried with them a deep distrust of water, a belief inherited from Europe. And in many cases, that fear wasn't completely unreasonable. Clean drinking water could be difficult to find. Milk spoiled quickly, and contamination was always a risk. Fermented drinks, on the other hand, were considered safer and more stable. Because of this, alcohol became more than just a source of pleasure. It became something practical, something reliable, something necessary. People believed alcohol could restore strength after hard labor, ease physical pain, improve digestion, warm the body in cold weather, and even protect against illness. In a physically demanding agricultural society, these beliefs gave alcohol a kind of legitimacy. It wasn't seen as harmful, it was seen as helpful. It wasn't the opposite of health. In many ways, it was considered a tool of health. That doesn't mean colonists were unaware of the dangers. They knew what drunkenness looked like, they saw the effects of excess, and when someone drank too much, there were consequences. Colonial authorities could punish habitual drunkenness with fines. public humiliations, time in the stocks, or even whipping. Taverns were regulated. Certain groups could be restricted from being served. But even with these controls, alcohol itself was rarely treated as the true problem. Instead, the focus was moral. The belief was simple: alcohol was a gift when used properly, but abuse of it was a sign of weak character. In this way of thinking, the substance wasn't blamed, the person was. And this idea shaped how colonists viewed intoxicants more broadly. A bottle, a leaf, or a tincture was not automatically dangerous. What mattered was discipline. If a person could control their use, the substance was acceptable. If they couldn't, then the fault lay with them. This mindset allowed drugs to exist openly within society without being fully condemned. At the same time, most healthcare didn't come from professionals. It came from the home. For many colonists, doctors were too far away, too few in numbers, or too expensive to afford. So when illness struck, the first response was almost always domestic. Homes were more than living spaces. They were small pharmacies. Kitchen gardens doubled as medical gardens. Families grew herbs alongside vegetables and flowers. Plants like lavender, fennel, comfrey, and hyssop were cultivated not just for cooking, but for healing. These plants could be prepared in many ways. Leaves and roots were dried and ground into powders. They were boiled into teas, steeped into infusions, mixed into syrups, or dissolved into tinctures. Some remedies were simple, made from a single plant. Others were more complex, combining multiple ingredients with sweeteners, fillers, or alcohol. And at the center of this domestic medical world were women. In most colonial households, women served as the primary caregivers. They treated the sick, prepared remedies, and supported families through illness and childbirth. Their knowledge was practical, learned through experience, and passed down over time. A household might never see a trained physician during a typical illness, but that didn't mean it went untreated. There would still be care. A tea prepared in the kitchen, a syrup mixed by hand, a sweating regimen to fight fever, a remedy carefully administered through memory and tradition. Colonial medicine wasn't confined to formal institutions. It lived in kitchens, in bedrooms, in gardens, and in storage rooms. It was built on daily effort, shared knowledge, and human care. And within that world, drugs in all their forms were not unusual, they were essential. When home remedies were no longer enough, colonists turned to the apothecary. But the apothecary of colonial America was not like a modern pharmacist. It was something much broader. A single apothecary could act as a physician, surgeon, dentist, pharmacist, and merchant all at once. These shops were centers of medicine, trade, and craft. Inside them, you could find ingredients imported from London and other parts of the world. Substances that ordinary families could not grow or prepare on their own. Medicines were not mass-produced. They were made by hand. Some liquid preparations took days, even weeks, to complete. Solid medicines required careful grinding, mixing, and measuring. This was medicine as a process, slow, detailed, and deeply personal. And within this world, substances did not fit into simple categories. They could be botanical, mineral, metal-based, or chemical. Some were dissolved in water. Others were turned into syrups using honey. Some were boiled, some steeped, and many were mixed with alcohol. That last detail mattered because alcohol was not just a drink. It was also a delivery system. It preserved medicines, carried active ingredients, and made powerful substances easier to consume. And this is where one of the most important drugs of colonial America enters the story: opium. Long before the modern opioid crisis, long before morphine or heroin, colonists were already using opium-based medicines. The most famous of these was laudanum, a mixture of opium dissolved in alcohol. It was strong. It was effective, and it was widely trusted. People used it to relieve pain, to treat sleeplessness, to calm coughs, to ease dysentery, and to cope with diseases like malaria. In a world where surgery was extremely painful, where infections were poorly understood, and where many illnesses had no real cure, a substance that could reduce pain and bring sleep felt almost miraculous. And so laudanum became part of respectable society. It was not hidden, it was not criminal, it was normal. Even wealthy and respected individuals kept it in their medicine chests. It sat alongside other remedies, herbs, powders, spirits, and imported ingredients, forming what was essentially a personal medical arsenal. But there was a deeper problem. Colonial Americans didn't fully understand disease. There was no germ theory, sanitation was limited, and treatments were often based on outdated ideas. Many believed illness came from imbalance or harmful substances trapped inside the body. So treatment focused on removing or correcting that imbalance. This led to practices that today seem extreme: bloodletting, purging, blistering, and forced sweating. Even minor illnesses like a cold could be treated with these methods. At the time, these were not strange ideas. They were standard, and this created a strange contradiction. A soothing medicine like laudanum might be used to calm pain, and right beside it, a patient might be subjected to a painful or dangerous procedure. Relief and suffering existed side by side. Yet despite all this, drugs continued to hold power, because even when they didn't cure disease, they changed how people felt, they reduced pain, they brought sleep, they eased discomfort. And in a harsh world, that was often enough. But access to these drugs was not equal. Wealthy families could afford imported medicines, maintain well-stocked medicine chests, and consult trained practitioners. Poorer colonists relied more on home remedies, local healers, herbal knowledge, and community support. Healthcare in colonial America was not one system. It was a ladder. And your position on that ladder determined what kind of care and what kind of drugs you could access. This inequality extended even further. Enslaved people lived within a system they did not control, yet they were not simply passive. Many preserved and adapted African healing traditions. They used plants, experimented with local remedies, and shared knowledge across communities. Some became skilled healers. They treated the sick, administered medicines, and even performed procedures like bloodletting. But their knowledge was often exploited, valued for its usefulness, while their freedom was denied. The same pattern appeared with indigenous knowledge. Colonists learned from native communities, adopted their plants, and integrated their methods into colonial medicine. But at the same time, those communities were displaced, marginalized, and erased. Knowledge moved upward into power, while the people who created that knowledge were pushed downward. By the 18th century, all of this created a world that feels strangely familiar. A person could wake up and drink alcohol, use tobacco throughout the day, keep herbs drying in their home, visit an apothecary when needed, and take a dose of laudanum at night. None of this required secrecy, none of it was illegal, and yet signs of dependence were already visible. People spoke of tobacco users as being enslaved to the habit. Moralists criticized excessive drinking. Writers warned about the dangers of opium. Even without modern language, the problem was there. Colonial Americans lived surrounded by substances that could relieve, stimulate, soothe, and seduce. It's easy to look back and find it strange, the constant drinking, the belief in tobacco as medicine, the casual use of opium, but the truth is more human than it is strange. Colonial life was hard, disease could strike suddenly. Pain was common, childbirth was dangerous, labor was exhausting, and medical knowledge was limited. In that kind of world, a drug was not first seen as a problem, it was seen as a possibility, a chance to feel better, a chance to keep going, a chance to survive. And that is why this story matters, because colonial America was not a drug-free past, it was already a drug society. It ran on stimulants, sedatives, intoxicants, and natural remedies. What changed over time was not the human desire for relief. What changed were the labels, the laws, the science, and the systems built around these substances. Colonists didn't live in a different story. They lived in an earlier chapter of the same one, a story of pain and hope, of profit and dependence, of medicine and habit, and of the dangerous comfort of anything that makes suffering easier to bear. So what were drugs like in colonial America? They were sacred plants turned into global commodities. They were alcohol at sunrise and rum at work. They were herbs hanging in kitchens and powders locked in chests. They were opium dissolved in alcohol, sleep in a bottle, comfort in a spoon. They were medicine and habit before those ideas were separated. They were part of healing, part of empires, part of inequalities, and part of everyday survival. In colonial America, drugs were not on the edges of society, they were part of its foundation. Drugs were not on the edges of society, they were part of its foundation.